Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the BroxtenDigital Show. My name is Broxton Davis. I'm a performance media analyst at one of the top advertising agencies in the world. I'm also the host of this podcast, the BroxtenDigital Show, which is my podcast where I bring some of the greatest minds in marketing and advertising on and interview them in the sense of giving students and young professionals, kind of the secrets to the industry. So with that, today we have another awesome guest who is going to bring a ton of value. I already know I had a short conversation with him before this, and I learned so much just from that. He's a bit of a music enthusiast, also has quite the storied career in advertising and marketing, ex-SVP at Donor, the ex-director of global creative strategy at Spotify. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Justin Norman.
Hey, how's it going, everybody?
Thanks so much for hopping on today, Justin. I know you're a super busy guy.
Yeah, I try not to be these days, but that seems to never be the case. So I appreciate the conversation. I'm excited to talk to you.
Yeah, definitely. I know we didn't get to talk a ton when we first met, but it was such awesome conversation. I had so many valuable takeaways. So I've just been since then so excited to kind of hop on here and have a more long form conversation with you. But to just kind of get started, this is something I kind of like to run over with all the professionals that I bring on. Is just, what was kind of your story getting into the industry, kind of navigating things and figuring things out as you broke into marketing and advertising?
I had the benefit of, um, I guess what you would call an enterprise mindset growing up. So I'm a serial entrepreneur since a kid. I used to sell, Pokemon and Magic the Gathering cards on the side when I was a kid, and, and did like party flyers for folks. Like I had a copy of Photoshop really young and a borrowed laptop, and I started from there. And then, frankly, like after getting into music and trying to become a music producer, I kind of split my time and got discovered both on the music side by some guys who were interning at Warner Brothers in Atlantic, and then by a guy named Kurt Shafitz, who I later found um, owned an advertising agency off Madison Avenue called Story Worldwide. But at the time, he was just doing random philanthropic things in the Detroit area. And I had started my own little design firm while I was in and out of college. I had done some things with a partner of mine that started a small design firm, and he was convinced that I was better than just running a little design company. He's like, "You got to come to New York. You got to figure this out." He asked me like 3 times. I was like, "No, I don't want to move to New York." And then when I finally did, I realized that the world was much bigger than, flyers and posters and cool designs for small organizations. There was a lot more that I could do, and there was a lot bigger industry than I was aware of for my little tiny corner of the world. And so from there, I kind of took off. Their main clients were like Unilever. So it was, I can't believe it's not butter and Suave, and a bunch of like consumer products that I didn't really know had this whole machine behind it. And once you work for one large holding company, you kind of start to see how they all work. And so that was really my break into the industry.
That's so cool. And I mean, what a unique route to kind of get to where you ended up, I know a lot of people that listen to the show, myself included, kind of did like, the 4 years in college, studying marketing, advertising, learning about the agencies, the client side, the sales side, and then kind of picking and choosing. But, I feel like the way you got in might even be a little bit better, just kind of like full immersed, figuring things out as you go. I know like coming out of college, honestly, I was almost like information overloaded of like, should I go agency side? Should I look for something else? Am I making the right decision to start my career? What would maybe your advice be to those students who are graduating, like it is the season right now in May, who are kind of maybe having those thoughts? What would you kind of tell them to maybe demystify and simplify things?
Honestly, I think the code to crack isn't in choosing, it's in doing. Me and one of the professors at CCS, I was sitting on a panel for Art Prize, and one of the fashion professors at CCS, actually think, let me put some respect on his name. I think he's the head of the fashion department at CCS. He said he had an apprenticeship to get into fashion in his time overseas. I told him about my apprenticeship in design. I was a part of an apprenticeship program for the Detroit Free Press when I was like 13. I was actually too young to join that program, but I was the only one who had entered as a designer. Most of the people were there trying to be journalists or writers. or reporters. I'm like, no, I have a copy of Photoshop and I'm in my school's art class and I do everybody's posters. And I ended up staying on for 2, 3 years as a graphic designer. Did stuff for the entertainment section and for the for the news and for the weather section. And it was fun, But I say all that to say, coming out of college, if you're like, which route should I go? I think that's the wrong question. It's what's available to me that's adjacent to what I think I should be doing, and then you should try it. Like, if you want to be, a music reporter, but what people are biting towards right now is hard news. Do the hard news. Don't say no to stuff because it doesn't fit squarely into what you went to school for or squarely into what you wanted to do as you were studying, because frankly, those skills are transferable and that experience is respected. I've had the opportunity to stay adjacent to my creative path. That's because I've been doing it since I was 13 years old. If you don't have that experience, get the experience. That's really my key advice there.
No, that's some great advice. I mean, like I work in paid search now, and I didn't really see myself as a paid search person in college or anything like that. But now I kind of see, I'm learning a ton of transferable skills, and you can kind of, especially at a big agency, learn a lot of different things from different teams. But I love your take there. I mean, I don't think enough professionals and maybe even professors are kind of saying that thing, like take what's available, because it is a crazy job market. And like all you see is the negativity on LinkedIn, and all these students saying I can't get a job. I've applied to hundreds of roles. Maybe taking that approach, definitely, at least if I would have had that approach going out of college, I think I would have had a lot more success and maybe put a little bit less stress on myself of like I need to fall into this role that I want to do, or maybe I'll never get it. There's a lot of area to move around in advertising. Speaking of which, I wanted to poke at another thing you were saying, just about like your come up story and how you ended up going out to New York. I know a lot of people from Michigan State typically move to Chicago, LA, out to maybe even New York, like you did. A lot stay here in Detroit too. I know I am staying here. I'm kind of like planting my roots now, really, really lean into the Detroit ad scene and really love living here. But would you, based off your experience, almost say like you'd recommend going out and kind of seeing the world at a bigger scale, to kind of like have a better understanding of the industry, or what would kind of your take be there?
I don't think you have to, but I do think you have to understand the landscape you're in, right? So if you're the type of person who really wants to get into movies and you decide to stay in Detroit, understand that your choices are now very limited being in Detroit, wanting to get into movies. That there's only certain kinds of movies that are really made here. You can direct and get your film funded and do whatever you want to do. It's a different path in Michigan than it would be in California. You have to understand that. And, I think to a degree, sometimes the online gurus and the Instagram motivational channels make you believe that you can do anything if you just put your mind to it, if you just follow your passion. Um, and I think there's merit to that, right? Like you can produce films, or people do produce films here, and some of them do get critically acclaimed. If you ask them if it was harder to do it in Detroit than it would have been if you had gotten a studio to work with you in California, they would absolutely, unequivocally say, yes, it was. You choose your hard. In California, it's a highly saturated, highly competitive field. But if you break through, there's real channels and pathways, and there's plumbing. There's plumbing there for what you have to reach who you want to get to. In Michigan, some of the plumbing is incomplete. It might be easier to get talent and folks around, might be easier to get location permits. It's a little less crowded, but the plumbing's bad. It's going to be hard to get to people here. You're going to have to probably make your own film festival and create your own opportunities. You have to travel more to get people involved in your project. You just choose your hard. But like at the end of the day, I think it really depends on what you have an appetite for. If you want to fight the rat race and be in a place that's more crowded, more competitive, you go somewhere else. If you want to create your own lane and build your own plumbing, then this is a perfect place to do so. It just depends on what hard you want to gravitate towards, but it's going to be hard either way. Anything worth doing will have its difficulties. You said something earlier about your career and you choosing to stay here. It's something that Professor Scott Galloway says a lot. And he's like, following your passion is BS. Nobody's passionate about tax law. But if you talk to a successful tax attorney, they're passionate about tax law. And it's because, frankly, success in any sphere feels good. There are people who have very successful janitorial companies who are very happy with their process of cleaning buildings and being very successful at it. I'm sure when they grew up, they didn't imagine themselves being janitorial professionals. You know, um, that does not mean you can't do something successful, interesting, innovative, and groundbreaking in those spaces. You just have to choose your heart.
I love that. Like the choose your heart thing is so true because just like either way you choose, like there's going to be the difficulties, there's going to be kind of like the figuring out stage, especially when you're young. But I think like even a bigger drape over what you're saying there that I think people my age kind of need to remind themselves of is just like kind of like you said with the janitor example, who knows where you're going to be when you're like 30, 40, 50 and saying like I founded this company or I ended up bouncing over here for a crazy opportunity. You kind of like I definitely catch myself doing it all the time of like I think I got it figured out. I think I can plan out how my next 5 to 10 years are going to go and then the next big thing happens and totally throws the plan off. So and I just feel like I keep hearing it from the professionals I interview too of like you kind of need to just slow down and like not focus so much on if you're doing things perfectly and just continue putting in the daily inputs. Is that kind of something you've leaned on in your career is just like focusing on things at a daily level rather than, big always looking at things bigger picture?
No, I think I bifurcate the effort. I think I think about the future. You know, if you put all of your eggs in a basket you haven't held yet, you're bound to be disappointed by the time you get to touch it, right? Like, but you just you don't know how big the basket is, you don't know how many paces it'll take to get there, but you invested all of your eggs over there. But if you've got all of your eggs next to you, there's no space for growth. You're looking at everything you have in one space and betting all of it right here. And so I think it behooves us to invest some time in what's adjacent to us and some time into what's maybe possible in the future. And it's not necessarily hedging your bets. It's really like responsibly spending your time. When I say do things that are available to you, that doesn't mean do them indiscriminately and without the thought of what you could do in the future. You should still hold on to your dreams and what you want to do. But while you're doing the thing that's adjacent, think about what's transferable from that thing and invest time in that, right? If you know you want to be a designer and you're in a role where design is only 50% of what you do your best at that 50% and get as many pieces of portfolio work out of that 50% of what you do. It's not ideal, but some of that's going to matter. Some of the stuff that has worked best in my career have been small things I did for random organizations nobody knows about, but I did my best. They didn't pay me the best. Then it wasn't the most groundbreaking thing I've ever been a part of. But it's the stuff that won me the award and got me the bigger job later on. You don't have to be singularly focused, but you have to be focused.
Then that's definitely something to think about is just like putting in that really consistent high level effort is what gets you those like rewards like you said at the end of the day, especially like when you're not even expecting them. And I love the analogy there with not putting all your eggs in the basket that you haven't touched but also not keeping them all close in, just to allow yourself to grow. Speaking on that, what were some stops maybe along the way, especially when you were starting out in your career? You talk about pulling from maybe experiences that you're not saying no to that don't exactly align with your bigger picture maybe, but still being able to like strategically pull the skills and everything you need from those roles. What were maybe some stops along the way in your early career where you had some of those like really big learning unlocks but maybe weren't expecting them?
So when I was really young, I'd say in my early teens, I had just left my job at the Free Press. There's a summer gig because I'm still in high school. And I'm thinking about college. I'm thinking about what I want to do for work. And I'm like, man, I don't know how cool a newspaper spread done in Photoshop and imported to Quark Express for the Free Press is going to be for like this big career I want to have. But I need more work. And, I've done some publication work. And there's this guy named Billy Kason in Detroit. And he's a serial entrepreneur in the black fashion space. Um, he runs a magazine called Ohio Trends. And if you know anything about the black hair scene between here and Atlanta, there's these things called hair shows. where salon owners and artificial hair manufacturers and all they get together and they do these big extravaganzas on like different hairstyles and different products and what feeds the beauty supply industry. And I didn't know anything about that. I just designed pages. Well, he needed another graphic designer to do the spreads for this magazine. This magazine is distributed in multiple states around the country. I didn't know that. So he got this small rinky-dink office off of 7 Mile and Schaefer in Detroit. It's like a little black building in a corner someplace. I'm like, what is this sketchy place I'm going to? And in that 2 summers, I did that. It was $75 a spread, uh, $30 a page. He would pay us. So, I mean, this is a 50, 60 page magazine, comes out every couple of weeks. And so I'm just designing these spreads with these big, larger than life hair pieces and these fashion models, and I'm doing it over and over and over again. And then the assignment that Kirk Chafetz, the guy who owned the agency in New York, asked me to do was to create spreads for a political magazine he was putting together for a big nonprofit in Detroit. That got done in like 30 minutes. He was on the plane from New York to Detroit, and he didn't have time to get stuff done. So needed spreads produced, he needed a poster, and all this stuff made like before he was thinking the day after. When he got to Detroit with his wife, not only were the spreads done, but they were printed, mounted, and ready to deliver because I had been doing work with local printers for 5 years at this point with huge publications. Like, and I knew how to make the spreads. I know all the markings. I know exactly what to do and to produce the stuff. He calls me an hour after he gets off the plane and sees that it's at his hotel already. He goes, "That's the most impressive thing I've ever seen in my life. Like how I talked to you 45 minutes ago. You've got this done." Um, when I talk about stops in my career leading to other things, and I talk about that adjacency, if I hadn't got that experience at some small, no name little thing, making spreads for a little bit of nothing, no money, there's no way I get the skill set that allows me to impress the guy that changes my life. And I always am very thankful for the fact that like those small random opportunities made it to where I could get to there. And then from there, creative, at age creative 100 and all these other things. I've gotten Clio's and Effie's and stuff. But it all started with black party flyers and hair magazine spreads. So yeah, I guess that I like telling that story because it's so random that it worked out that way. But
I mean, no, that's so cool. And like that kind of thing definitely I'm sure is repeated in your career. I've already seen a little bit in mine where, you're in those moments, years back and probably not thinking anything of it like, oh, I'm at this, repetitive, not having the most fun job. And then, a couple years later, come to find out that skill you learned or that person you met ends up being somebody pretty important and what you're trying to accomplish a couple of years later. So that's just so cool to hear that and kind of get that reaffirmation that, it does happen. And even when you're in those roles, maybe put in that extra effort and you never know what kind of opportunities are going to come out of it. So kind of as you progress then, and you started to have those learnings, maybe, made that big wave with the posters and started to look back and like, okay, the skills I'm developing are kind of starting to play out. I'm seeing the bigger picture here. What were some like key changes that you started doing once you really like started to catch momentum that you think helped propel yourself?
the first was knowing that the skill set I built was very monofaceted. I was very fast with design and very good at making creative decisions because you had to make creative decisions fast. What I didn't have was what people who go to 4 year universities have and who do internships have, which was the occupational rigor. I didn't know a whole lot about the underbelly of the advertising business, what the bottom lines were for some of these big organizations, how their OKRs and KPIs really affected the way they hire agencies like ours. And I didn't really even understand metrics that well. I understood like if I do this well, this magazine sells more. If I make this client happy, they're happy and they pay me more money. So I knew the agency side, but I didn't understand the other side of the fence. Like, why are they paying this money? What did they want to accomplish by doing this? How do they gain reach? I knew local media. I didn't know national or global media. And so the biggest change I did was become a student of the gang. I had to go from being a person who was intimately knowledgeable about the production space, from the print production to video production to being a designer to being occupationally proficient as an advertiser. And that change in mentality was one that required hours and hours and hours of study, independent study, that was not paid for by my employers. It was done in situ at the office when someone went, hey, this needs to reach this many people and this needs to do this and the CTA needs to feel like this. I had to go and research what that meant. This is before Chat GPT. This is before, you know what I mean? This is a little post Ask Jeeves. You know what I mean? Like it's so, I had to dig and read books and I became a student of the greats, the Ogilvies, the Wyden the Kennedys, the Deutsches, the guys who, um, stories like Mad Men are really written about. You know, these guys who went and started their own agencies, and the David and Goliaths. Like the DDBs. Like I just learned more and more and more about the agency world, and so, you know, um, I speak to kids coming out of college today, and they know so little about the classic agency. They want to go to one of these big digital shops, and we're seeing more and more of these digital shops shrink. When I first got into business, digital was everything, 360i and huge and all these. I've worked in some of these places where like they went from 2 offices to 13 offices globally in 3 years. And now they're back to 2 offices, 3 years later. Technology runs and moves fast. But I think the main thing I learned was, if there's a space I don't know, you either lean into mentorship or you become obsessive about study. And I kind of tried to do both.
That's awesome to hear. And would you say that's like something you still actively do, even at the later stages in your career?
Absolutely. I think the more senior I got, the more you tend to not be able to learn in the job. There's stuff that's above you. The further you get up, the more headspace you realize there is. And even as like a super senior person in a huge billion-dollar tech company, I went back to school. I went to Kellogg School of Business for a year, um, just to brush up on the corporate structure stuff. The CMO level thinking, the board thinking, because now I'm presenting to boards. It was much less like, oh, talk to an ECD. I'm reporting to a CMO. It's like, no, the decisions I'm making, the stuff I'm writing is centrally affecting the state of the business. And so I've got to learn corporate enterprise on a level that I didn't know before and understand things about consumer pathing and user journeys that you don't have to know as a creative director, but you do need to know as a senior marketer at a much higher level. I'm running multi-million dollar budgets. These aren't like, oh, $2 million to go shoot a spot. No, this is 100, 200, 60, 70 million advertising budgets across multiple countries, which each country has its own set of KPIs and OKRs and needs. And so, yeah, I did not feel properly armed. And so I spent $32,000 of my own money and went back to school and studied while I was still on the job. You know, um, that doesn't mean you don't take the job. You know what I mean? Like there were parts that I was much better at than everybody else. But the parts I didn't know, I wanted to make sure I knew. And that independent study kept me in those roles for years to come.
Yeah, I mean that's obvious commitment to continuing your education right there. Just even paying for that extra schooling right out of pocket like that. Most people just in the first place wouldn't even be willing to do that. But I love what you say of like you spend, especially in your early career, all this time, learning the platforms, hands-on keyboards, learning all those hard skills, and then kind of as you progress, I know a lot of us obviously have those goals. There's a whole different skill set that you kind of have to become accustomed to. It's just kind of crazy to even think about, once you get to that CMO or just super high senior level, you're not reporting to somebody else in advertising or a client who's dedicated to the marketing team for that client. you're dedicating to people, you're presenting to people who are dedicated to making sure the company is, having a return on investment every year, which the stakes definitely get a lot higher there.
And
Um,
different. They get
right.
different. Like beyond them being, I guess, having more gravitas, these folks aren't talking about creative success or audience response and sentiment. They're not talking about net promoter scores. They're talking about our shareholders lost 2.2 points year over year average in the Dow. Like, why is that happening? Wait, you go, okay.
What
Like,
are you going to attribute that to?
exactly. Marketing has very few one-to-one attribution points. And so now you have to think more broadly about how marketing affects the state of the business. And like that's a different level of corporate enterprise thinking than just being monofaceted in the communication space.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of building on, going into those big meetings and presenting to new people. That kind of happens throughout your career. One minute you're presenting to your manager, a couple years later you're presenting to a SVP, and who knows, that presentation could be what gets you promoted or not. What are some things you did throughout your career to just kind of make sure you were locked in for those presentations or meetings, and just obviously you were able to come out of them with quite a bit of success? What would you say you were doing?
I needed to know what was important to my boss, and then I needed to know what was important to their boss, and then I needed to know how those things reflected in the business. You know, I think managing up is a skill you get over time, and I've had better success with some folks than others. You know, because some folks have a harder time of managing their own expectations. But understanding how to be useful to your superiors is one state of the work. But then superseding that, what is your role actually meant to do for the business? If you don't really understand that, you're going to have a hard time increasing the level of importance that your role has to all of your partners, right? If you believe that as an art director, your job is to make things pretty, you fundamentally don't understand your job. If you think as a creative director, your job is to manage the creative process, you fundamentally don't understand your job. You know, title director in and of itself has implications. The prefix to that tells you how that departmental change affects the role of director. And then understanding your organization on top of that helps you make decisions about how to manage up and where you need to be. And so, like, I could talk for a long time just about that in general. You know what I mean? Like, the lower you get on the totem pole, and I say lower from a foundational standpoint, if you are entry level employee at a business, you have to understand foundationally what you are meant to hold up because you are the foundation of the business. If you are middle management, you have to understand as a pillar of your your silo in the company what you are holding up in your role. And if you are a senior leader, you have to understand what, as a senior leader, you are maintaining the roof on. But in each role, you are holding up a part of this business. And if you don't get it, then yeah, this is going to be a temporary thing for you until you get there. The careers are built to me on that shared understanding. And until you get to a place where you understand it, you're still going to be a student of where you're at.
Yeah, I mean that is such a great way to put it. Of just like, obviously you were like, I could say a lot there because there is kind of a lot that you have to figure out. I'm starting to realize, I'm going on a year in the industry now, being out of college, and going in, I kind of did have that false narrative of I can just kind of lock in on this stuff, learn it real quick, and start applying what I'm learning, and I should move up, right? But then as you start to think about things and break things down and look at how am I actually delivering value for the clients? How am I delivering value for the business that I'm working for? And then how am I even delivering value to the people above me or the people working side by side with me? There's a lot of different assets to kind of start figuring out before you really start to, I would say, like have people start noticing you and picking up on, the value that you're actually providing. Did you ever feel like any early points throughout your career you were like doing everything right and just not getting the recognition you deserved?
Yeah, there's a bunch of things that I prefer not to talk about of why that happens. You know what I mean? I think for a myriad of reasons, people can be very protective of the station they hold. The place it happens most often is in middle management. There tend to be folks in middle management who can get very clicky about where they are, and they hire their friends. When they change positions, people tend to come with them. And when that happens, sometimes folks can ring fence whole portions of the business that all of a sudden become jocks versus nerds. You know what I mean? And that's not a great environment for growth. It's not a great environment for anything to that degree. But um, I've had several instances in my career where I've had creative directors and senior leadership um, overly represent my work to where my visibility is low. You know,
Okay.
which can hurt a young professional when people don't know who did what. When it comes time for promotion talks, and it's like they're doing a great job, they're just performing at the tick that they need to be. There's no reason to move them up, you know. But also in advertising, this has been this culture of people getting promoted every year. You know, every year you're up for a promotion schedule, and we keep making more reams in the ladder to placate young professionals and feeling like they have career growth. It's um your entry, then your junior, then your associate, then your
Senior
native, and then
associate.
your senior, and then your senior associate, and now you're a VP and an SVP and an EVP, and it's like, okay, like, has my job fundamentally changed, or are you giving me 3% more money and giving me a new title to make me feel cooler? Um, and so, yeah, I think in business nowadays, there is the tech bro way of doing it, where everybody has the same title, which I don't love. You know, we hear a lot in some of the larger tech companies that everybody's a creative specialist. We don't give people new titles. You know, we have different ranges that we pay people, but everybody's a specialist. And it's like, that doesn't make people feel good, and that's not an environment for longevity. But neither is I've done a year at designer, and now I'm a designer two, and then I do a year at designer, I'm designer three, and I do another year, and I'm designer four, and then now I'm senior designer one, and I'm senior designer two. Jesus, what's different between designer one and designer two? Well, you get
Exactly.
paid a little bit more, you know, and so I think companies need to do a little bit more in creating an environment where upward mobility feels worth the energy. And I think employees, young professionals coming in, should interrogate that stuff a little bit more to understand kind of like what their upward mobility looks like before joining an organization.
Yeah, that is some great advice and something like definitely feel like out of college I was a little bit nervous to maybe bring forward an interview or something and kind of, as you get a little more confident in yourself and in your career, you realize like that is really something I should be thinking about. I could get offered something really flashy and nice, but if there's no headspace above me and it's going to be stagnant for 5 to 10 years, is that really the best move for you? Um but I mean that is just overall some really phenomenal advice on being able to handle that. What would you say then maybe for like to the student or young pro who's in that position, what could you do to maybe go about just advocating for yourself and getting that hey I did this work out there?
I mean, first, once again, understanding what's important to your manager. You know what I mean? Like if you know on the onset that you have the type of manager um who needs that level of, you know, what's the best way of saying this? I'll say this a different way. Um, coming into it, sometimes your manager isn't the type to promote people very often. You know, there are some managers who just are much more sticklers about that. I think the idea of advocating for yourself has some pitfalls. You know, for a manager who's not looking to do that very often, you've got to figure out what it is about them and what they need in terms of the importance. But sometimes managers, when you're really good, just want to keep you where you are because you being where you are makes them continue to look good. They don't want to lose the talent that's really good. They want to keep you there so they can continue to look good. And in those cases, I actually suggest getting the best book you can out of the situation and leaving. You know, like some people like put your head in the sand and keep going. It will come to you eventually. No, I think if you've done 2 years and all you get is exemplary remarks, and this guy is like, but I'm not putting you up for promotion, take that work and go somewhere else. But you've got to know what's important to you. And so I've said this to quite a few people that have worked for me, and I'll say it to you. If you love the work you're doing and getting paid well, don't worry about the title. Don't worry about the title. If if in that work there's room for upward mobility in terms of your pay, but and you still love the work, don't worry about the title. Get the best work, do the things you love. The work will speak for you when you and your tenure will speak for you when you leave, right? You can tell people what you got paid and they can see the work that you've done. They'll give you the bigger title in the next job. Don't leave something you love because your friends have big fancy titles and you're still stuck at this thing. That's one of the worst things you can do because they're envious of your work. The guy who's an SVP at the company who's stuck in middle management looking at banner ads at the digital agency every day is very upset at the designer too at Facebook. You know what I mean? Like if you can keep doing work, you're only getting paid 10, 20,000 less a year. If you don't need that 10, 20,000, keep the cool job, man. Like don't be so worried. These bigger companies do promote people quite less. They do. Netflix is not going to promote you as quickly as Stellantis is going to promote you, and Stellantis is going to promote you far slower than a Universal McCann who's got the headroom and can make as many random titles as they want. Right? The titling is there to keep you feeling motivated. Not and if you can tell very quickly if that's the case if your title changes and your job hasn't materially changed, the title was to make you happy. It wasn't to promote you to a new role. And you've got to be able to tell the difference. And so like between understanding that and then being able to see, okay, what's the impact my work has and being able to represent that impact, you should be able to navigate your career pretty well. And it won't matter who manages you. You'll know your value. You know that you can transfer that value to another company, or you can stay where you're at. And that's where the power as a young professional becomes developed. It's not in trying to advocate for yourself to this dude who you have no idea what he wants and where he's at in his career. Middle management is a hard ceiling, and you'll know when you hit the ceiling. You're super junior, then you come up, and all of a sudden everything you do is on the chopping block and go, okay, I've hit the wall. Let me build my book in whatever department you're in, whether that's you're a program manager and you can look at how much year over year in terms of budget and impact your work actually has on the business. If you're in sales and you look at how much money you brought in, no matter what, build your book, take a drip from the bucket every day you can, and then build your case. And you choose who you take that case to, whether that's taking it to the company you're with now or to another company. um, yeah, that would be my advice.
No, that's some great advice and something that I think, early in your career you're probably pretty nervous to do, as far as like burning bridges, hopping companies, you get told a lot. I know I did in like high school and even early college, like, bouncing from company to company is not the way to go. You're gonna, create a bad reputation for yourself. But you also gotta like have the distinction to know when it's time to go and do something that's better for yourself. And I love how you just kind of like framed it up as, this is how you identify when it's time. And this is kind of the strategy around it. The only one piece that I'm kind of wondering is how are you able to make those moves without burning those bridges? Like, how did you go about having those tough conversations, especially maybe if it's a manager who, was kind of holding you back and wasn't the guy you clicked with?
I don't think you have to have those conversations with them necessarily. Like the cool thing about most states now, and most of them are at will employment. So for you feeling a sense of loyalty to a company, I promise you, they don't have the same sense of loyalty to you. They'll cut you, and you'll be dropped, and there will be no fancy exit interview. Um, there won't be some like long drawn out thing. Usually it's thank you for your service, goodbye. I think sometimes as young professionals, we believe we have to have this like huge case and oh, I'm so sorry, and I'm not getting what I want developmentally from here. And it's like, no, you actually don't have to do that. I think I'm looking for a more senior position. we've discussed it in our last peer review that that's not something that's available here. So I'm going to be looking for opportunities elsewhere. Thank you for the time. I loved working here. I loved working with you. If there's ever an opportunity for that higher role later on down the line, I'm always available. Here's my contact information. Talk to you later. Like it doesn't have to be deep. It doesn't have to be emotional. It doesn't have to be like, oh my God, you're the best mentor ever. Some people weren't the best mentor ever. Some people weren't the best boss. You don't have to tell them that to their face. Listen, I enjoyed my time working with you. I really appreciate what you've done for me at this company. I'm looking for a higher position elsewhere. And we found out that that wasn't necessarily available here. Thank you for your time. I'm looking for it. Looking forward to talking to you later. Like keep it simple, and the benefit to you as a young person is that you don't need that much money. Um, you don't need that much money. You know, um, frankly, like if you're in your early 20s, early 30s, like you have the unique opportunity to take less money to do something better for your life. Unless you ended up, with a huge family. Everybody's circumstances are different, but like hopefully you set up your life early on to be able to do things in a fashion that doesn't necessarily need you to do.
No, that makes a ton of sense, and I think it's something that you don't realize is like, when you do get to the point where you're at that director, VP level or whatever, you got the family to take care of. You have who knows how many real estate investments. Like there's a lot more that goes into making a career move or, doing something that's better for yourself. So I think that that's some great advice to just like do it while you're young and kind of have that opportunity rather than be super worried about, what kind of the consequences might be or, if you might step on some toes or something in the process. You gotta really do what's best for you when you're at that point in your career. And I know we've just spent a ton of time kind of talking about the J Norman come up, all the different stops along the way and everything. I also know like you're doing some really cool stuff now, and I think people who listen to this kind of content are going to be the ones running the ad industry one day. I plan on being up there myself, as the career progresses. I definitely want to get into what you're kind of doing now to be so successful and that kind of thing. Just kind of jump into that, what are some things nowadays that you're catching yourself doing that's just like leading to this continued success and growth?
I guess so. I'm an introvert mostly. I'm not some super sociable guy. Where I
You wouldn't guess
found,
that off first impression either.
I guess I'm okay at faking the funk these
Yeah,
days,
like when you
but
presented it to the group that I was in, I was like, dang, this guy knows how to talk.
it's a practice performance. I promise you that much. I'm much more reserved than that in most spaces, but I'll say that what I'm finding is that uh, being valuable to the greater community has been a larger boon in my life as I've become more senior than any accolade or work has been. It's having conversations like this. It's being a part of the boards. It's being a part of the community organizations. I sit with the Design Corps of Detroit. I sit with the UNESCO board. I sit with AdCraft. I sit with oh man, it's a bunch. And like I've gotten to the point now where that work and those connections are bringing me business and opportunities because I didn't go into them looking for business and opportunities. I went in there to be closer to these organizations, to give something to the community that gave so much to me. And in doing so, there's a level of exchange there that I don't think was really expected from me. So I think the further you get along in your career, the less it's about, you know, um, climbing the corporate ladder and more it's about adding value to the world. And the more I add value, the more I tend to get back.
Dang, yeah, I mean that is some real stuff right there. I guess as far as like from the student young perspective, obviously, you're super busy. We like to say we're super busy. What could be some ways you find, you obviously find time to fit in doing all that other stuff on top of what you're doing professionally. What would be some ways that you'd recommend, people who haven't maybe done, anything like that that are young in their career to just kind of take that first step and get involved?
I mean, look into your local marketing and advertising organization chapters. See if they've got any events going on and just go to one. You can block off an hour or two to pop into a happy hour. You can take a Friday morning and go to a creative mornings meetup. Each city and each state has some version of these things. Pop in, say hi, take a friend, and just see what other people are talking about, what other people are doing. I think you'll be surprised at how much alignment you have with other young professionals in your neighborhood. And then I think stay a student of the industry. I think the closer you are to understanding what's happening in your business, the more you know how to stay in contact with people as it's happening. You know what I mean? Like, if you know that one of your buddies works at a parent company that just folded in, reach out. Hey, man, I'm sorry that happened to you. You need anything? That stuff goes a long way. If you can add recommendations for friends as they're looking for new work, believe me, like, do it because one day that's going to be you. It's inevitable. It's inevitable. And when it does, you'll be happy you've built that community. You'll be happy there are people looking out for you. You'll be happy that you understood what was happening in your marketplace. You saved a little bit more money before it happened. You know what I mean? World's crazy right now, and so taking care of each other is kind of the way to do it, and that includes our professional careers as well.
Yeah, I'm definitely picking up on you. Just a lot of that, you kind of get out what you put in type of vibe. And it just kind of seems to compound the more you put in, the more that value is provided to you. And you bring up, that continued education piece, kind of being a student of the game and continuing to learn, even when you might think you got it all figured out, is kind of the secret there. One thing I'm kind of dying to ask now that I thought of is there anything right now that, that you're leaning in on as far as your continued education that you think people might be sleeping on as far as like marketing and advertising goes?
I don't know if they're sleeping on it, but I definitely think it's often misunderstood. And it's this advent of what people are calling artificial intelligence, when really it's a suite of tools that are using big libraries of language from human beings to create opportunities for answering questions and developing different processes that I think if you don't at least understand the basics of, you're going to be in a world of hurt later on. And so I've been paying super close attention not only to the technology, but also to the organizations that own, run, and operate this technology, from both the ethical, the legal, and the practical application side of it all, and um, and its effects on the business holistically, right? From creativity to how we research data. I find it fascinating. I think I find it far less scary than a lot of people do. But I also understand the long-term implications now, how it could be scary, and so I think um, sometimes the best bet is knowing your enemy, but sometimes a better bet is understanding who's your enemy, who's not, and right now I'm just trying to decipher between the two.
I think a lot of people are in the same spot, but I also think you bring a really good point of like it gets so much less scary once you understand it. Like the way you just summed up what an LLM is. Most of the people I feel like saying AI is coming to take our jobs, you should not be using AI, couldn't break down what LLM how you just did right there on, it's a giant pool of stuff humans already said and all it does is give you the most predictable answer. That's kind of the science of it at the end of the day. So yeah, I mean, just taking that time to educate yourself immediately lowers that like, oh my God, this has never happened before. What are humans going to do? We've kind of seen this kind of thing happen. I'm sure like when the internet came around, there was so many people saying the internet's going to be the end of everything. And, look at that now. So are you kind of doing that? Like, do you relate this AI revolution towards some other revolutions that you've seen throughout your career?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, technology to the uninitiated is indistinguishable from magic. I think the closer you get to something being mind-boggling, the more people sensationalize it into something it isn't. And I think it behooves us to its core at least understand its origins. I think the one thing that's different about this um, than any other technological revolution, like the computer, like the internet, like data centers, you know what I mean? Like before even the stuff with LLMs, like, the rise in the larger chips and the larger computational capacities have all changed things year over year. It's been a wild time to be alive. But what's different about this one is the idea that this time around, the technology could supersede our own understanding. That's the part where people get freaked out. there was no point, I think, my time playing Oregon Trail on a Mac G2 that I thought that like this thing's going to like be smarter than me one day. You know what I mean? But with this new stuff, the idea that these things would be able to do things that we wouldn't understand, even though we made it, gets us to a space of uncanny valley to a degree. And so when I think about the computational power of AI as a tool, it excites me. When I think about generative AI and superseding human thought, that's when we get into a place where I think maybe we're making some mistakes.
Yeah, I would have to say I would agree with you there. I mean, the chance for like economical gain with AI is pretty unreal and like pretty crazy to look at. And when you start applying it to different facets of businesses, you can really start to just unlock things that weren't there before as far as like revenue streams and opportunities to grow. But at the same time, yeah, I mean, if we get to a point where you can't trust anything you see on the internet, what is advertising going to become? What are influencers going to become if you can't distinguish if it's a human or not? So I'm curious to see how it plays out. I think we're taking the right approach to it of, be somebody who's highly educated about it and can speak on what's currently going on. So then, you at least have a handle on it now and you'll be able to keep up with, the rapid developments as they happen. But yeah, I love to kind of always end on, kind of what's happening in the now. But that kind of wraps up, the segment where we walk through all the different experience, that kind of thing. This next segment, though, favorite part of the show, we do it every time. Just the rapid fire value segment. I got some questions prepared. We'll rip them to you just off the top of the head. Super actionable advice and insights for the students and young pros listening. To get started here, what would you say is the best free or low cost tool that you've been using in your day to day that people are probably sleeping on?
Right now it's Claude. Learn Claude,
Claude.
learn co-work. Yeah, learn co-work. It's incredible. Just don't use it to cheat. Use it to elevate. Like, but Claude co-work is a game changer. And then I would add on to that um, an AI enabled voice to text modeler is really important. I use WhisperFlow
Yeah, I
personally.
was just gonna
There's
ask
a
to use Whisper.
Yeah, but there's a bunch of different ones that I've tried, and like frankly, like just being able to dictate with a level of accuracy what I'm thinking very quickly and not having to type it really has changed.
Yeah, who knows if in, 10, 20 years we'll even be using keyboards. And I'm so happy finally one of my guests bring up Claude Code and Claude Cowork. I've kind of been leaning into that lately. And oh my God, like spend 20, 30 minutes watching YouTube videos and you can literally start to automate every repetitive task that you have in your life. It's pretty insane. And I definitely would recommend anybody listening, go check it out, hop on YouTube, $20 a month, and you can start doing some stuff that you probably didn't think was possible before. But to kind of transition away from that into something that, we hear a ton of while we're students and even, as we get into our careers, soft skills and hard skills. You hear about it a ton, you should be developing them. And I kind of want to just break it down with you. So to start, what would you say is like the number one soft skill right now that students and young pros should really be leaning in on?
Presenting. Like if you can take a small idea or a big idea or anything in between and properly represent in a room without fumbling over words and without misrepresenting what you're doing while getting people excited about the stuff, then you're almost 100% ahead of most other people. That's the part that no matter how good someone is at something, um, that usually is the thing they let go of is their ability to represent the work properly. I've seen people who are far less skilled than other folks make it much further because they're very good at presenting. So you gotta practice the presentation skills.
Yeah, I love how you ended there on practicing. There's really only one way to make those soft skills better, and that's practice and repetition. And it's not something that comes naturally or you can just learn. On the flip of that, though, there is the hard skills where you can just spend some hours and you're probably going to figure it out. What would you say right now is the number one hard skill we should be going for as students and young professionals?
Research. I think what has happened over the course of the last, I think, decade as technology has gotten better is that people have lost the ability to do their own research and find their own answers. They lean on one or two tools and that's about it. And there's no stronger hard skill available to us as human beings than the ability to derive our own information. And so, like, yes, know the tools that are available to you, but also know how to go find reference, ask questions, interview people, learn from stakeholders, learn from mentors, and develop your own index of things in your life because it'll serve you throughout your career.
Yes, definitely. I mean, that is just so true. Just the part you bring up about interviewing people, like I could have never gotten this great advice and insights that I've gotten through doing 10 episodes of this podcast from anywhere on the internet. So just goes to show, learning how to do that and do that research and come to your own conclusions is so important and kind of a big unlock for you. Now, kind of, similar thing, but what would you say is your number one piece of advice for any students, maybe graduating or young professionals just starting who really want to stand out against the rest of junior talent? What's one thing they could be doing?
Be unafraid to put your work in the world. I think a lot of times folks stick with spec work and they only talk about the things that's been published at their agencies when honestly being active in the world and having your own brand that exists in the world will get you much further. I know people who have gotten senior roles early in their careers just because they were very cool on TikTok. You know what I mean? Like, don't let go of who you are and what's um, really what you're really passionate about. You don't necessarily have to make that a job, but you should put energy into it and let the world consume that stuff. There's a way that DJ Jazzy Jeff said it, and he said empty the tank before you die. You know, don't die with ideas left in the tank. Don't die with gas in the tank. Like just let it out, let it exist in the world. Somebody will like it, and if they don't, then who cares?
I love that. And I think that is definitely something myself even can, try to remind myself of like lean into your passions, lean into what you're good at and put it out there. Who kind of knows what wall it's going to stick to. Um, I know we just talked about tools, but what would you say also is the number one free learning resource for students and young pros right now that they might not be using?
Uh, yeah, might not be using. I guess I just said like I still think YouTube University is the best place in the world. You know, there is just an endless amount of content, both reputable and not reputable. So you got once again that research, you got to know who's who. But like you can pretty much learn how to do most things off of YouTube. And so mixing YouTube with this new suite of online collegiate things. I mean, where it used to take a few $100,000 to get a Harvard education. Between YouTube and Harvard online, where you could just take a couple of classes that matter to you, you can get pretty freaking close to at least the trade knowledge that you want to know. You won't be a Harvard grad, but you'll have some stuff behind what you're saying. And I think um, if you've got a couple of dollars and some time between the YouTube stuff and some of these free, I mean, a lot of these big universities even throwing some of the lectures out for free. Go listen, go absorb some of this stuff, and I think you'll be better for it.
I love that. I mean, just take advantage of what's out there. There's so much out there, and with the tools we have at our access now, you can synthesize this information and just take as much time as you want to learn it and take it. So take that advice and run with it. I know I definitely am. Now, this last one here I got for you, LinkedIn is such a huge thing. Obviously, one of the first things I ask you is, hey, can I get your LinkedIn? You're on there for a good amount of the day, especially as a young professional, trying to comment, get your name out there, that kind of thing. What would you say are two people on LinkedIn that all students, young pros should be following in the marketing world,
Ooh,
other than yourself, obviously?
I don't really post on it. I should. I'm a big fan of Scott Galloway. You
Okay.
don't have to necessarily agree with his political views, but I think as a marketer and a thinker, he's got a great head on his shoulders. And then, probably Seth Godin. Those are probably the two that I would say the most on the internet that I would think was valuable. And I'll say like, if you want, if you can sift through it, again, Gary Vaynerchuk says stuff every now and again. There's also a lot of noise. You got to sift through it. Gary's very good at volume, but every now and again he says something that goes, I agree with that. That was pretty good. Those are probably the three voices that I encounter the most on the internet. But I tend to find that.
No, and yeah, like the main reason I asked that is just because, like you said, there's so much noise out there, and so many people, they might have the title that positions them as somebody young professionals might think knows something and can be totally spreading false narratives and just not even the right thing. So it's I always want to ask that just because there is the select few on LinkedIn who are actually out there posting that valuable content that you can take away and use in your day to day. So that's awesome, and I'm definitely going to be checking out those people. I know I already follow Gary, but I definitely agree with you on some of his videos. I'm like, all right, dude, shut up. And then other
You
videos, I'm
gotta
like,
sift
oh my
through
god, this guy's a
it.
genius.
Yeah, you gotta sift through it. He's a sensationalist at his worst, but can say some really grounded stuff when he's on target, especially when he's on other people's podcasts, not his own content.
Yes, I would agree. It's
Yeah,
usually somebody else interviewing him that gets the good information out.
yeah.
All right, well, that kind of wrapped things up for the rapid fire value. That was awesome. I mean, like just listening to that little 10-minute segment right there, so many valuable takeaways and stuff you can go, implement in your day to day or week to week life and really start seeing that difference. And I would definitely say, better luck finding a job while you're doing that stuff. A lot better luck, getting promoted and putting those things Jay's saying into practice. Kind of help you at any stage of your career, whether you're that person that doesn't know, what do I even start applying to, or somebody who might feel lost in middle management. This advice is applicable everywhere there. But to kind of close things out here, Jay, this is a question that I always close on. I figured out in college when I was doing these one-on-ones that this is just like a crazy question to ask because it unlocks like just really awesome value, and I had such great takeaways from it. But with that though, I just want to like have you picture yourself back when you were like in that 20 to 22-year-old mindset, just breaking into the industry. I know you kind of said, moving out to New York, doing crazy things. You're super motivated, super hungry, but it's just the reality that you're also super ignorant that at this point in your life and your career. What would you say is the number one thing you would have been doing differently, and what difference would that have made today?
I don't think I would have stayed in that initial environment as long as I did. Um, so a lot of times, well, you know what? I won't even go that way. When I first got to New York, I freelanced a bunch. The guy who brought me there and put me in position, I freelanced on some stuff with him and worked in my music stuff and was there for a while. But I think the allure of the New Yorkiness makes you want to kind of meander around longer than maybe say someplace where you really needed to hunker down and get to it. And a lot of people in that first spot were not happy with their job or their careers. We would go out to lunch and everybody's like, working, this. And I should have taken that as a signal that maybe this isn't the best place to stay and do things. I got there eventually, and I mean, one of the guys I came up with there is the head of creative at my agency that I'm building now. So it's like it's not that it was for nothing, but I guess to translate that into some level of a takeaway, I think you have to be unafraid to make a pivot. I think sometimes people stay for the comfort or for the money or for the apparent opportunity. But at the point where you look around and everybody's miserable, go do something else. Like there's nothing about work that requires you to be miserable. There's nothing about work that requires you to sit next to a boss who like is playing video games in the corner and won't return your messages. Like you don't have to deal with that, man. You know what I mean? Yeah, I guess like have a set of values that matter to you, and if anything is counter to those values, make a pivot. I think I should have developed that earlier.
That is some great advice and just something that I think is so hard to do. It's something that maybe takes some years to develop until you really recognize, what's best for me, what are my values, and what is aligning with them. And I definitely think, you get that false narrative too of I'm a young professional. I'm lucky I got into a job. I see a bunch of people who are struggling to get one around me. I'm just gonna, like you said, put my head in the sand and, hope things work out. But you also got to know when it's time to move, obviously. And, obviously hearing you say that, I think just, should really be some inspiration of, leaning on your values, be authentically yourself, and you're gonna want your career to match up with that, and you'll get the most growth out of that. Um, But that was all, everything I had for you today, Jay. This was such an awesome conversation. I just want to thank you again for coming on the show. Getting to interview people like you is just so awesome for me, and also is I think going to be the game changing thing that lets people at my age kind of unlock and realize what they need to do when they start getting into these roles of, oh my God, I'm running an agency now. What were people doing before me? And these kind of interviews are going to be where that information is found. So just thank you for that. You're providing a ton of value and just a ton of great resources, ton of knowledge. I know Justin Norman on LinkedIn. Anything else you'd like to plug real quick at the end here?
Follow me, J Norm on Instagram. That's pretty much the only two places I'm on the internet. So yeah, appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Yes, sir. Thank you for coming on. Is there anywhere we can check out like any of your work or anything like that?
Yeah, jnorm.com or versahook.com. That's my agency and my personal consultation page.
Okay, sweet. I know there's a lot of creatives out there at Michigan State. I'm sure they'd love to kind of check out some of your work. So I just wanted to make sure that was out there. But like I said, thank you so much for coming on today, man. This was such an awesome interview. And, can't wait for the next one.
All right. Talk to you soon. Bye.